What's up everyone, welcome back to the channel. This week we are going to be going over my 15 favorite and most used tools in Maya 2024. I get asked quite frequently about the tools I use, especially about the ones that I dock on the top on my shelf. And I know for a beginner jumping into Maya, it can be quite overwhelming with all the different options and tools available and trying to figure out where to start. The good news is there's only really a handful of tools you need to get the job done. Everything else is rather situational, at least in my opinion. And the more you use the software, the more you will learn and find out what works best for you and your workflow. There are many different ways to get the same job done when it comes to 3D modeling. So the best advice in my opinion is jump into your 3D software, try things out and see what works best for you. I personally use these 15 tools in my workflow more than any of the others, and I use them in almost every 3D model I create. So before we go over what's on my shelf, which is this large bar that goes across the top of my Maya scene, you can add and dock your own tools to it by pressing Ctrl and Shift and clicking any tool, and you can dock them to the top of your bar. Now before going through these specific tools that I use, I thought we should first start with a few of the more important tools. Now there is no particular order to this list, but starting off at number 1 is the good old Extrude. This is more of a necessity as you can't really model or make many shapes without it, and it's definitely one of my most used tools, so it felt fitting to put at number 1. You can find this tool under the Edit Mesh tab up here, and if you come down to Extrude, and a nice little shortcut is by pressing Ctrl E, and you can also access this tool. And a really quick and easy way to actually access these menus is by holding down the space bar, and you can go over to whichever you want. So the Edit Mesh, and you can go down to Extrude as well. To be honest, I don't use this spacebar feature that often for some reason. It's probably just habit, and I probably should because it would be much quicker. But those are just different ways you can access these tools. So Extrude is a tool used to create depth and dimension, usually extruding something like a face, for example. So on this box, I can go ahead and select this face and press Ctrl E, and I can extrude it to add shape. And this is basically the main way that I go about modeling and the main way you create shapes in basically any 3D software. Now you don't necessarily have to extrude faces. You can also extrude edges, or can you extrude vertices? Oh, look at that. You can somehow extrude vertices as well, but I never really do. I basically just extrude edges and faces, but yeah, you can just extrude your shape, and that's how that tool works. All right, so coming in at number 2 is Bevel. This is another one of those more crucial tools used in all 3D softwares. It's used for creating a bevel along selected edges or the edge of selected faces or vertices. This is definitely another one of my most used tools and probably one of my favorite. In my opinion, adding bevels to edges really helps make models look better because even the straightest lines in real life have the smallest bevels, and it can really help make your models look more realistic in a lit scene. But be careful because it's really easy to start adding lots of polys into your scene, so use it with somewhat of caution. But you can find this tool under the Edit Mesh tab as well, and a quick and easy shortcut is by pressing Ctrl B. So for example, I can select all of these edges or one edge, and I can press Ctrl B, and I can bevel it. Now, depending on how big of a bevel you want, you can change this fraction by adjusting the slider, and as well as increasing the segments to figure out or choose however rounded out you want that edge to be. So bevel is extremely handy, and I use it in all of my models. And it's a really nice way to add some nice rounded edges to your objects. All right, so coming in at number 3 is Bridge and Append to Polygon. Now, these are technically 2 separate tools, but they work very similar, and I use both in different situations. I thought they should just be grouped together. So firstly, Bridge, I use this tool definitely more often. I use Append to Polygon more so when I was starting out, and I feel like I don't use it that often, only in certain situations, but we're gonna really quickly go over both. So starting off with Bridge, it's a really nice way of bridging 2 objects together. So let's say I have this cylinder, and let's delete the outside faces, and I wanted to recreate that cylinder we just removed, and I can just double click both of these edges and I can bridge them together. So you can find that tool under the Mesh tab, or sorry, Edit Mesh tab, and you can go down to Bridge and you can bridge them. Now, Bridge only works on one object, so if I had 2 cylinders here and I wanted to combine these, I would have to first combine them into one object, and then I can select those faces that I wanted to bridge together, and I can simply go up to Bridge. Bridge is really handy. You can do it with different objects in your scene depending on what you got. So let's say for some reason I had this and I wanted to bridge these together. I could just combine them into one shape, delete the faces that I wanted to bridge. Now they need to have the same amount of vertices to bridge. So if I had, for example, this, it's not going to allow me to bridge because it doesn't have the same amount of vertices. So I'd have to remove this edge. So there are both 4 vertices on each one, and then they can simply just bridge together. Another really great thing about bridge is that you can make really simple pipes. So let's say I inserted 2 separate cylinders. I'm going to combine them into one mesh. And then delete those outside faces. And then I can combine or bridge together these 2 edges. Now the only difference this time is I'm going to turn this curve type into bend. So when I increase the divisions, it's going to give it a nice bend, and you can have a really nice pipe shape depending on how high in polys you want it. So there are many ways you can use this tool. It's very powerful and definitely one of my most used. Now, Append to Polygon works basically the exact same way as Bridge, but you can only select one edge at a time. So let's say we had these 2 cubes, for example. I'm going to combine them into one object, and I'm going to delete these faces. Well, if I go up to Edit Mesh, Mesh Tools, and go to Append to Polygon, I can actually go ahead and click on whatever edge I want, and all the other edges I can append it to will show up in purple. So I can basically go through and select this edge, and it will just bridge together those 2 edges. Now, of course, you could obviously just select these edges and also bridge them. But Append to Polygon works in different situations where you specifically want to handle a certain edge and attach it to another edge somewhere. I can't think of any on the top of my head, but there's definitely a few situations where I do use this over bridge. But I wanted to mention both since they both work roughly the same way. All right, so now that we have those crucial, important tools out of the way, we can start going over the ones that I'd like to dock on the top of my shelf. So starting off with center pivot, freeze transformations, and delete history. So I like to keep these as one. Technically, yes, these are 3 separate tools, but I like to look at them as one. So every time I'm done a model and I'm ready to export, I always center pivot, freeze transformations, and delete history. They're all important in their own ways. You can find each of them up here. So center pivot, you can find under modify, under the pivot, center pivot. You can also find freeze transforms just above that. And then you can find the delete history under the edit tab, delete by type history. So center pivot's pretty straightforward. So if I have the cylinder and for some reason my pivot is moved to the side, I can actually just center my pivot and move it back into the center of the object. Now, if you want to change your pivot point, you can press insert on your keyboard, and if you highlight over a face or an edge or a vertex, you can align it to either of those. So I can select this face and it'll align it in the middle of that face. But let's say this vertex right in the middle, and I can then rotate it along that vertex. And if I wanted to center that pivot again, I can use that tool to center it back in the middle. It's always nice to have your pivots centered unless you want them in a specific location, but otherwise they should always be in the center of your objects. And freeze transforms is very important. Obviously, if you're animating stuff, you maybe don't want to freeze your transforms, but if I look at my attribute editor and the cylinder, you can see that in the real world space, it's all zeroed out because it's at the 0 point in Maya. Now, if I move this along the x-axis, you're gonna see that translate, that information change. Now it's sitting at -4.878 on the x-axis in this world. If I scale it up, the scale information will change along with the rotate and so on. Now, this is when I export, I don't want Maya to remember this. This is unnecessary information that I don't need unless I'm animating, and it can cause problems too because this can just move around because of this information. So let's say I'm happy with this shape and how it is. I can press freeze transforms and it'll zero everything out. So now this shape is how it is in its real world space. Now you have to remember that this does change it. So if I go into my tool settings and I go into object mode, it's now the same as basically my world space because I zeroed it out. It doesn't know that it's rotated anymore. So freeze transforms only when you're done and you're happy with it as like a final, this isn't freeze all your transforms so nothing moves. but it's definitely something that I always use before I export. And along that is the delete history. That's pretty straightforward. So if I have a cylinder in my scene and I bevel this top edge, for example, now that bevel modifier is going to be attached in this history. So I can go back and edit it if I want to. But that's a lot of information that's unnecessary if I don't need it. So if I have, you know, hundreds or thousands of objects in my outliner with history, it can really slow down your project, and you don't want to keep that history when you're exporting because it's just unnecessary. So once again, deleting that history will remove that information. So now it's nice and clean. There's no history with this object anymore. And if I click all of them, it's basically ready for export. So I like to group these all together at the top of my shelf here, and you'll see they're always up there, and I always use them together in all of my videos. All right, moving along to number 5 is my see all. Now this is just beside my delete history, and that's just to see all. So I like to hide objects all the time in my scene. So if I have a bunch of these little objects, and there's a larger one here, and I'm working on these 2 small ones, and I just don't want this to be here. Not only can I isolate it by hitting this little icon right here, but I just want to hide it. So you can press Control H to hide an object, and I like to hide many objects when I'm modeling, and you'll notice they're hidden when they kind of are like semi-transparent in your outliner on the side. So these 2 objects are hidden. And when you have so many objects, you can obviously click on this and go Shift H to unhide it. But I have a show all because I tend to hide a bunch of objects, and then once I'm done, rather than going through and using all that time to manually unhide specific objects, I can just press this tool and it unhides everything. I use that so often that it was just handy for me to dock onto my shelf. And you can also find that under the display, show all, show selection, or show all like I have docked up there, or hide and hide selection. All right, moving along to number 6. Just to the right of that is my UV editor and my 3D Cut Sow UV tool. Now this isn't a UV mapping tutorial, but starting in Maya 2024, they did remove your UV editor from the shelf up here for some reason. I always liked it up here, and rather than going to my UV tab and then going UV editor, it's just one extra click since I'm always UVing objects. So I thought I should just dock my UV editor as well as the 3D Cut Sow UV tool, which is on the bottom of this UV tab as well. And to be honest, this is the only tool that I use when it comes to my UVs. These 2 alone is all I really need. So if I have a cylinder, and let's just modify it a little bit. Let's just like, I don't know. Let's add, let's say I had an object like this. Well, what I would really do really quickly is use that 3D Cut Sow UV tool. So let's open up my UV editor by pressing that one tool. Now I can see my object, and I'm just going to do a camera-based projection to remove all those cuts. And then using my 3D Cut Sow UV tool, I can go right-click Component Edge, and I can actually click on those edges wherever I want to make my own cuts. Like I said, this isn't a UV mapping tutorial, but I use this tool all the time. So that's why I dock it up here. Because then when I lay out my shelves, Control U, Control L, they're cut along wherever I clicked on those edges. So 3D Cut Sow UV tool is such a magical, amazing tool. You guys should all use it for your UVs, and it'll probably make your life a lot easier. All right, and moving along just to the right of that, coming in at number 7 is probably my most asked about tool, which is the Align tool. Now, there's new features in Maya that actually makes this a little bit easier, that you don't really need to use this tool necessarily. We'll go over that really quickly, but I use this tool all the time. So let's say we had an object here that was like a long skinny rectangle, and I wanted just to align it to the center of this object. I can shift select it and press that, and it just aligns itself in the middle. This is just super handy when I have moving objects around, and I get asked about this all the time. Now you can find this tool under the Modify, Snap Align Objects, Align Objects. But before you use it, hit this small little square that you see on the side, and make sure, so when you're in Maya, it will come in like this. Make sure you check on World X, World Y, World Z in the Align to Last Selected Object. That way, when you use it once, you can go ahead and then dock it by pressing Control Shift and clicking on it, and it's going to be up here, and those options will always be there. Otherwise, it won't align perfectly into the center. But I love this tool and I use it so frequently. Now, recently, I believe in Maya, I want to say 2023, but one of the recent updates, they added this awesome update for match transformations, and you can match the rotation, the scaling, the translation. So let's say I have a cube, let's delete it over, and I scaled it up and I've rotated it. And I'm like, oh, I want it to be back in this position. Well, you can use that align tool, which I would use because I'm so used to it, but you can also just use this modify translation. So it would just appear in its spot. Not only that, but you can also match the rotation, or you can match the scaling, or you can just match them all, which is extremely handy. So now it's over top. So there's different ways you can go about it. I love this align tool though. It's just something it's probably just habit now, but I use it all the time. All right, so moving on to number 8 is a harden and soften edge. Now, this is really handy, so handy that I actually decided to dock it up on my shelf. So let's say, you'll notice when you export objects, sometimes you have like a hardened edge. So for example, this one edge is hard and I don't want that. Well, I can just select that edge and smooth it out. You'll find this happens all the time when you're extruding. So let's extrude this edge on the top. Well, now those are all hardened and this bottom half is smooth. Because if I export this into Substance, it'll actually remember this information and show it just like this. So what I would do is select these edges and I can press my soften edge and it will soften them. Decided to group those two together since they're basically the same, and that is one of my most used tools for sure in Maya. All right, so moving along to a few other tools, and I'm gonna try to make this fairly quick, is the target weld tool. So that's just over here to the left of my center pivot. And this comes on the top of your shelf automatically, and this tool is pretty amazing. So let's say I wanted to weld these vertices over, well, I can use this tool to actually click on one and weld it over. Now, your tool settings is important because you can weld it to a target or to the center. So I can weld it to this target, or I can to the center of these two. They will merge together. So I wanted more of like a triangle shape, I could do that. Or if I wanted more of like a ramp shape, I could just weld these ones over. And it's extremely handy. The target weld, I use it. It's definitely one of my most used tools. Now, if your tool settings aren't up for some reason, you can just double click on any of these on the side. Your tool settings will pop up. I always dock it just to the side of my outliner because I use it very frequently in situations just like that. All right, so coming in at number 10 is the multi-cut tool. Now, this is definitely another one of my favorite tools, and I use it all the time. There's so many different situations where this tool can be helpful, and it's at the very top on your shelf, just to the left of the target weld tool. You can find the multi-cut. And there's a lot of different things you can do. So if you hover over this cube, you can see it's attaching to different points. So I can attach it to either a vertice or to an edge. And I can basically connect an edge between two vertices, just like so. And let me press G on my keyboard to repeat the last move. And I'll connect one between there. And just like that, we can create a little roof or pyramid. Now it's pretty smooth, these edges. So let's select these edges and use that harden edge tool that we talked about earlier. And multi-cut tool is handy in a lot of other ways. So I use it a lot to create edge loops. So if you hold Control on your keyboard, you can see it will create an edge loop around an edge if it obviously can. So I can add one on the top and the bottom here. And if you hold Control and Shift, it will also snap. So if I wanted to find the point in the middle of this square face, I can just roughly locate that spot and click. Now, not only can you just add edge loops around, but you can just manually click them wherever you want as well. So I can go up to one of these vertices and I can start just clicking on this face depending on whatever shape I wanted to create. And then I can maybe select this face and extrude it outwards. So multi-cut tool is extremely handy. And one of the main reasons I actually use this tool is to clean up my topology. So after modifying a shape, and going in afterwards, as you can see, there's a lot of empty points that need to be connected. Well, I can use that multi-cut tool to start going in and cleaning up my topology. So it's very helpful. and I use it in basically every model that I do, and if you don't, it's definitely a tool that you should look into. So another awesome way you can add edge loops into your scene is with the Insert Edge Loop tool. Now this is under the Mesh Tools tab at the top. You can find Insert Edge Loop, and it works very similar to the Multi-Cut tool, but this gives you a couple more options while inserting those edge loops. So in the tool settings over here, once again, if you don't have your tool settings open, you can double click any of these options on the left menu and it'll pop up your tool settings. And I like just to dock it beside my outliner. Now inside these edge loop tool settings, you see that there's two main options here that I tend to work between. So the first one's equal distance from edge, and this works very similar to the multi-cut tool, basically the exact same. So I can manually slide it along an edge to insert that edge loop wherever I want it. But sometimes you don't want to manually do that. You want to space them correctly an equal distance apart. So if I wanted two edge loops on each end and I wanted them to be the exact same distance, well, Insert Edge Loop tool is extremely handy in this situation. So I can click on that tool and switch this over to multi-edge loops, and I can choose how many edge loops I want. So I can add 2, for example, just like I was talking about, and I can just scale those apart. And now I know they're going to be equally apart from each edge on the top and bottom. And now you can do that multiple times, so I can add 20 edge loops if I wanted. And the best part is they're always going to be spaced out equally from one another. So I use these two tools hand in hand, and that's why I'm both combining them for this number 10 for my most used tools, because these two I definitely use very frequently. Coming in at number 11 is this Circularize tool, and this is just to the left of the multi-cut tool. And this is pretty straightforward. You can basically, let's say we added this plane, I can select any amount of faces. So let's grab like this cube, I can hit that tool and it will circularize it. This is extremely handy for making circles on faces, or if you have a cube and let's say I wanted to do some weird shape here, I can actually, let's use some tools. So let's use that Insert Edge Loop. I'm going to add one in the center of everything to increase some polys. And let's extrude this edge and then let's circularize it. So now it's going from a cube shape. So let's add a supporting edge on this end. Using the multi-cut tool. If I smooth it out, now I have some weird shape that goes from a circle to a square. So Circularize is very handy. You can just basically create circles, but you have to have enough geometry around to actually create that circle. Otherwise, it's not going to create it. So for example, if this edge wasn't here and I selected these and I pressed Circularize, well, it kind of does it, but you know what I mean. The more polys and more geometry you have, the better your circle shape will appear. And I use that tool very, very frequently. Along with the Circularize tool, I use the Extract tool. So Extract is very straightforward. It's just separating an object from something. So let's say I wanted to separate the cylinder from this plane on the bottom. Well, I can select all of those faces, go up to Edit Mesh, all the way down to Extract, and it will now turn this into two separate objects. And you can extract anything. So I can go ahead and select these, let's say these faces. I wanted these to be separated. I can extract them. Let's now click on this object, center my pivot. I can drag that upwards. And let's just combine some of these. So let's just combine this back into one shape. Maybe I wanted to select all of these edges and bridge them together to create some indent. You get the idea. So extract can be used in many different ways. It's just extracting or separating some faces from an object. All right, moving along, number 13 on the list is merge to center. Very straightforward. So if I have a cylinder and I have all of these faces, I can just double click this edge, extrude it, and merge them into the center. I use that tool all the time. Definitely when you're feeling lazy and you don't want to just have really nice topology, you can just merge them all to the center and have a bunch of triangles. Obviously, that's not the best advice, but it's just merging to the center. You're going to use it quite frequently, and it's always docked up here. Now, along with that is fill holes. So let's say you wanted to fill this hole rather than merging them to the center. Well, I can double click that edge and I can go up here to mesh and fill hole, which is going to fill it. Now, obviously that's not that great. Merge to center is better because it'll actually give you topology, and this is not going to be great to use. However, it's useful in certain situations. So if I wanted to create a really quick bolt, let's say, I would actually use that fill hole. So I'm going to go mesh fill hole. Then using that multi-cut tool that we talked about earlier, I can go ahead and add some vertices, or attach some of these vertices together. And then I can go select these outside faces, extrude those upwards, and boom, we have like a flathead screwdriver. But let's add these edges now because I extruded them and they're hardened. We can actually soften those edges. So look at that. We're using another tool we talked about earlier. And now I have a nice simple screw. Now obviously this topology is not nice, so you would have to go in with my multi-cut tool. And I would personally go ahead and do something like this really quickly to clean it up. And just like that, we have a nice little low poly kind of bolt looking shape. So fill hole can be extremely handy. All right, last but definitely not least, coming in at number 15 on the list is Boolean. Now you may have heard the term Boolean before. It's widely used in a lot of 3D softwares, and it's basically cutting out a hole or some sort of cutout into a shape. So you can find the Boolean tool up here under Mesh at the top under Booleans, and there's a bunch of different options depending on what type of Boolean effect you want to create. So for example, let's create a cube into our scene. I can go ahead and insert a cylinder, and let's scale that down. And what I'm gonna do is just make a small little cutout on the top of this cube. And I can do that with this Boolean. So what I'm gonna do is insert this, depending on how deep I want that cut to go. I'm going to shift select my cube, and then I can go up to Mesh Boolean. And depending on which object you selected second, so for example, difference A to B or difference B to A. In this case, I shift selected my cube, so I wanna select this option, B to A, and it's going to make a nice cutout into that top face. Now the really nice thing is this is not destructive, so you can go ahead after you create that Boolean and go ahead and modify it depending on where you want to move that cut. So let's say we wanted it right over the edge here, and I'm happy with that. I can go ahead and select my cube and just delete history, and it will remove that information, and now I have a nice cut into my cube. Now the main thing with Booleans, you have to remember that you have to clean up your topology. So as you see, it has lots of these vertices now that need to be connected. And in this case, I would use my multi-cut tool, and I can go ahead and start connecting these vertices. But as you can see, there's so many vertices when you do Booleans. So I find it's really nice to create Booleans with as least amount of polys as possible, if you can. So let's go ahead and delete all of this out of here. Let's reinsert my cube, and let's start off with another lower poly cube. So what I would do in this situation, if I wanted to create a small hole, I would bring down the subdivisions from 20 to maybe as low as 6. Now I do know ahead of time, because I do need to connect some vertices afterwards, so I like to prepare my model for this Boolean. So for example, I would add one nice edge loop, maybe right here in the middle. So once I do this cut, I can have a nice edge loop. Now you don't have to do this ahead of the Boolean, you can do it afterwards. I always like just making those cuts ahead of time. So now I can go in and shift select my cube. I can go Boolean, difference. Now I have a nice cut. Now all I have to do at this point, delete the history to remove that information. I can go with that target weld tool and weld together these vertices. And using that multi-cut tool, I can now connect these vertices. Now because I made it in a lower poly shape, there's way less vertices to connect and work with, and it just makes my life much, much easier. So if I wanted to have a nice edge on this, I would just simply add a nice bevel. Now this cube's gonna collapse on itself, but if I hit 3 on my keyboard, you can see that this hole that we created retains its shape nicely. And you can do the same for the inside edge as well. So if I wanted to add a nice bevel there, and I hit 3 on my keyboard to preview smooth, I have a nice hole into this cube. So Boolean is extremely handy in so many situations, but like I said, it's always easier in my opinion to work with lower polys if you can. Now there are different options you can do as well. So let's insert another cube, and let's insert another cylinder, and this time let's use a different option. So I'm going to go up to Boolean, and let's union. So union will combine two shapes together. So if I press that, now this is one object. And let's Control Z, maybe we can choose another option like slice. So this is actually going to take a slice out of whichever one I click second. So let's do the opposite way, and let's choose slice. Now it's going to slice it out. So it gives me a nice cutout, and there's different ways you can work with these shapes depending on your workflow. So I can use this to now possibly extrude outwards or inwards. Experiment with these Booleans, they're super powerful, and just remember to delete your history when you're done. And that's Booleans. So those are my top 15 most used tools, and I did fit this under half an hour, but I'm gonna go over because I'm gonna do a few extra. Really quickly, there's a few extra tools that I thought were extremely helpful and I use all the time, and I thought it would be important to not miss because I use them literally on every model I create. So the first one is in the modeling toolkit. So I always have it over here beside my attribute editor, but for some reason, if you don't, it's just up here in the top right corner. And there's so many different tools in here that are very, very helpful. But specifically, I use the transform constraints. So there's different ways you can go about this, but I'm just gonna show you with this torus. And it's more handy when you're actually modeling, and you'll find yourself needing it, I'm sure, a few times. So if I wanted to move this vertice along this edge without just manually eyeballing it, well, I can just constrain it to that edge, and I can just slide it over, and it's gonna follow that edge. Same with this side, which is really nice. Or let's say I wanted to slide it just along the face. Well, I can just slide it. Now it's not gonna follow that edge anymore, it's following the face, but sticking itself to the model, so I actually can't drag it off. And this is very handy. I use it in just so many different scenarios, but this does exist. So for somebody new in Maya, you'll find it in the modeling toolkit. Your edge slide and surface slide for your transform constraints are extremely helpful. And I'm sure there'll be a situation when you have an edge like this and you want to slide it down without, you know, completely messing it up. Well, you can just go edge slide and it will just follow it for you. Very helpful. And also wanted to add the smooth modifier. I use it all the time in all my videos, so I thought it's something I should really quickly go over. And for example, that Boolean we made earlier. So if I have this Boolean hole, for example, that we had earlier, you'll see that if I hit 3 on my keyboard, you can preview smooth an object. So if I smooth it, it's gonna just collapse in on itself. And that's maybe fine. Maybe we want a hole to look like that, kind of like a belly button looking weird thing. But maybe we don't want that. Maybe we want a hardened edge. So I can add a bevel to strengthen up those edges. And now when I smooth it out, it's gonna retain that shape, that hard edge, which is exactly what I want in this situation. So smoothing an object out can be very beneficial when it comes to, I don't know, Booleans, or let's say we have a cube and I want to just, I can add some like large bevels to it, and then I can smooth it out and it'll look nice and smooth rather than being all low poly. So I can smooth out these edges, but as you can see, you're still gonna see that low poly shape even though it's trying to treat it as a smooth edge. Whereas if I actually smooth it, it's gonna round out those corners. But I'm previewing smooth, so technically if I export, it's still gonna show like this in another program. So I need to actually add that smoothing effect, and you can find that under Mesh and Smooth. So now it's actually smooth, and you can increase the divisions, which will add a lot of polys to your scene, but make it look more smooth the more divisions you have. And to be honest, I rarely go above 2, even 3 tops, just because it adds so many to your scene. But this is a great way for low and high poly modeling. In the new Maya update, they have the unsmooth, so you can have this higher poly, and you can work your way back down if you wanted. Extremely helpful, depending on how smooth you want your object to look. So this, once again, is, if I wanted to add a smoothing effect, I would go up to Mesh, Smooth, maybe increase those divisions up to 2 so it's nice and rounded. And if I was, let's say I wanted to export this, it does create a lot of unnecessary polys, so you can go in and clean it up if you want by just selecting those edges and pressing Control-Delete. You can just clean it up a little bit for those unnecessary edge loops, so you can save on those polys. But Smooth is great. I use it all the time, probably too much, but it's a lot of fun. And if you want really realistic looking models, you're gonna be using it all the time. All right, now to really quickly wrap up this whole video, I thought the last tool would be the EP Curve tool and Sweet Mesh. Now, yes, these are 2 separate tools, but I'm combining them into one because I use them all the time together. So if I wanted to create a rope in my scene, for example, I would go up to create to your curve tools. Now there's different curve tools and they're all amazing. I just tend to use EP curve tool for no particular reason. I just like it. So I'll create a rope shape. And once I'm happy with it, press W. This is what I got. Let's say I want to edit it. You can right click, go control vertex, and you can just edit any of these vertexes depending on where you want your shape. So I can position it around objects in my scene. And once I'm happy with how it's looking, I can select that whole curve and I can turn that into a sweep mesh, which is under the create tab as well, just below the curve tools. And that will turn it into like a rope, into a sweep mesh. Now, sweep mesh itself is very powerful. There's so many different things you can do with this, but I'm not going to specifically go over everything. It's not a sweep mesh tutorial, but really quickly, you can increase the precision to increase those polys. So if I put the wireframe, you can see how it's very low in polys, and the more I slide this slider up, the more polys it's going to have in the scene to crank it all the way, and it's just going to be a really nice, high, dense tube looking shape. I can also change the scale profile, so I can shrink this down to be more of like a rope looking shape. And there's many things you can do. So let's just increase that back up a tiny bit, and you can actually go into the distribution. You can actually turn that into more of like a, I don't know, 5-sided, maybe a 6-sided rope. So we can add a twist to it. Let's add like a 20. And then all of a sudden you have a twisted rope. Now, obviously this is gonna increase your polys like an insane amount in your scene, but sometimes it's nice when you're going for realism and you're not really worried about your poly count. There's so many different powerful things you can do with sweep mesh. So I highly recommend opening this up and experimenting. You can even turn it into like more of a ribbon or a rectangle, more of an arc shape, depending on whatever you're trying to achieve. Anyways, that is how I create basically all my ropes and all my models. And that basically completes my list of my 15 or rather 20-ish most used and favorite tools in Maya 2024. Thanks so much for tuning into this week's video. If you liked it, give it a like, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel to see more weekly 3D content. And as always, thank you so much to all of my Patreons for all of your continuous support. You guys are all amazing. Thanks again for tuning in, and I will catch you all in the next one.